Oh, it's for you.
Oh, thanks. Hello?
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Prepare for takeoff.
Happy House has always birthed creativity.
All artists are related to each other.
You're now listening to Stepner Show.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have a guest here that I never expected to have when I met her. And alas, here we are. Ladies and gentlemen, Sherí Kelsey is here.
Hi, thank you so much. I, too, never expected to be here.
Welcome to Happy House.
Thank you. It is happy.
This is a podcast that I do that captures the idea of how we balance a well-examined life using creativity. And after all the conversations you and I have had over the last year and just watching your journey as a writer and a poet, I am compelled to have you here because I definitely feel that we connect and want to share your story with the listeners and the viewers. So we have a book here called Layers and Waves.
Yes.
Tell us about this book.
Well, one, thank you. I have to say thank you so much for having me. I love that thought of like a well-examined life. I almost feel like I examine it too much. Like sometimes I have to tell myself like chill out and stop examining, like just go out and enjoy life. And so it is a balance, right? And so, yeah, love that. And yeah, again, thank you so much for having me. So Layers and Waves Healing Transmissions it's interesting because I've been writing kind of as a way of like healing and self-expression for so long. I think I've actually always been writing in a journal, writing here and there. I think when I was younger, I like didn't really put my real thoughts on paper because I was so afraid that somebody actually would like see them and find it or read it. Now I'm like, oh, I wish somebody would have read my journal. Yeah, so it was really therapeutic, and I really started to focus in on writing more once I started therapy a while back. And so this book, it's funny because it kind of came to fruition while I was working on another book, right? And I had my mind set on finishing this one thing. And you know how life happens. People are like, oh, we'll just be open to other things happening. Like, are you sure that this is the book that would be your first one? And at the time, because I kept writing all of these like little poetry and prose, and really it's just the raw emotion, right? Where the other book that I'm still working on is kind of like the whole story behind everything. But these things just kept popping out. And I had so many of them. And finally a friend was like, hey, like this is a book in itself, right? And I started looking and I'm like, it tells a whole story. And so that is really how Layers and Waves Healing Transmissions came about.
Oh my God. And now that it's published, how are you feeling that it's out in the world?
Yeah, it's so funny, like the different steps, because I think going through it was like, well, and I say this, the different steps, like I remember putting it all together and handing to, like now she's my editor, but and a good friend, and handing over, and she'll still laugh because I wouldn't let go of the paper, right? Because I was like, holy shit, I'm sharing my heart with someone else is going to read this, right? And so then it was like different steps along the way, right? Where you have the other people start looking at it, editing it, and right? And so then it's like more and more, and then finally, the time that you do release it, you're like, okay, there it goes. And then I remember even thinking like, oh, well, what are past colleagues going to think, or what, right? It's interesting, like where it's all, creativity, you have to really look at, some things that are your resistance and your fears actually. And so it's so interesting that it wasn't like, well, what good could this do for other people? Like sharing your story and like, people that resonate. My first inclination was like thinking, oh, what are these other people gonna say, right? And you're thinking like, well, didn't think I had haters, but right, it's so weird that that was like where your mind goes when you're afraid to share something. And then often I keep feeling like, oh, it does that when you know you're supposed to share it. Like, right. So.
And you have this rock star approach. You are
like
out in the community, performing, reading your work out in public. At bookstores, poetry shows, and you are out like putting these books in bookstores.
Yes.
Tell me about that. What's it like to actually take something from your mind, put it on paper, print it, and then take it all the way to bookstores and into the community?
I think it would be different if I truly thought that it came from my mind, right? Where I don't. Anytime I would try to like put it in my mind or be like, well, what? And I think we've talked about this, right? And so I'll say it out loud again, but the way that it's written, it's subsetted into 10 chapters that I call waves, right? And so each wave is a different subset of emotion. So whether that's like resilience or heartbreak, family trauma, like different things. And so I say that is that I knew the name of this, and my rational mind, or I kept thinking like, oh, let me think of like the different types of waves. Like, I'm not a surfer. I don't know. I was like literally trying to be like scientific and like, let me be clever, and it just wasn't working. And then finally I was like, well, maybe this has a natural rhythm anyway, right? And that's how it became waves, and they just all kind of flow together. And so that was an interesting part when I learned, when I try to do something, I hold on too tight and I'm trying to make it work. Like, that's not how this, or at least this project, is going to work for me. It's really just like letting go and like trusting in something more creative and bigger than I. And so to say that is, I think that if it was like me, I don't know if I would have had the courage to go out there and start being like, hey, everyone, I wrote this book, please put it in your bookstore. I think it was really like, oh, when I decided to put this together, it came together very fast. And I always think when that happens, it's because it's meant to be, and there's something, cosmically on your side to do that. And so then, because it is healing transmissions and it's these deep, raw emotions, it felt not fair for me to keep it. Like, I already know these stories. Like, these now aren't for me, they're to be shared. And so then it was cool because then I kind of separated. I'm like, oh, now I'm a marketer. So now I just go out and see, and let's just see, right? I didn't know that, bookstores would take the book, which is really, really neat. I didn't even know that I initially would just like self-publish, right? Even that, like every single part of the journey was such a learning experience and an unfolding of healing even then. And even when you talked about, going out and like reading, like I was afraid to do that. That wasn't something that came easy. And I think I even have one like poem in here, prose. It's really about like being scared to death to be seen, but knowing and hurting so bad because I'm not. Right. And so then it was interesting too, because like when I'm like writing this and like digging in, I'm like, well, are you seeing yourself? Right? Like, who do I want to be seen from, right? And obviously I think that comes to like a deeper childhood wound, and there's things there, but it was like, oh, well, maybe you can see yourself more and realize how like resilient and wonderful you are, which I think we all have the capacity to do.
Oh my God, that's incredible. And I feel that there is a lot of ebb and flows and waves just emotionally and with our experiences, and to take that and to relive a lot of that as you're writing and as you're reading. When you take your inspiration from where you're pulling from, all your experiences, and you're writing, what's it like as you are reading these in public? Like, how do you reconcile with like the journey from writer to publisher to marketer to performer?
It's interesting because I think it was, I've stood up and read like, a few different like poems here and there, and and one of you were there when it was at the Poetry Lounge, right? And there's so much going on, so it's just like you're kind of just adding to the collective energy and feelings and healing that's going on there, right? And so it's like a beautiful part to a beautiful experience to be a part of that. Recently, when I did the Romans bookstore, that book reading, it was interesting because it was just me, right, going through different parts of the book, and then also explaining like my story and why I wrote this and where this came from. And I realized like, oh, I'm so used to this story, right? And that's another thing that I think that it's important that before we share certain things, like we do need to ensure that we're healed from it, right?
Oof,
right? So that way we're not going and passing me like, oh, these things happened to me, shoot, right? Because that, now we're just throwing this around, right? And so I say that it was surprising to me because I'm so, I don't want to say grounded in this, right? Like I've done so much work, and I can never say, oh, I'm done, right? That's not how life works. But like I know my story so well, and I've sat with it for so long and like really made peace with different things. And so when I was saying it, like I almost forget that there'll be a reaction, right? Or that I almost forget that people will be like, wow, like that's resilient. Wow, like that's so inspiring. Thanks for sharing that. So it was neat to see afterwards, like people came up to me and was like, well, thank you so much for like opening up your therapy session. And they weren't saying it like mocking or like, oh gosh, thanks for throwing the shit at us, right? It was like, thanks for being so vulnerable and open, right? And then afterwards, I even received a few Instagram messages of people just being like, that was really inspiring to hear you stand up and say those things out loud. So that was really cool.
That is a beautiful answer to that complicated question.
Like, whew, good.
What I find beautiful about that answer was the fact that you mentioned that when you share this work, it's important to be healed.
Yes.
And that's something I've never thought about before. I would just like get up there and be like, here's my blood and veins, you know. To be healed really feels like it's actually the best place to share from. Yes. Because you don't want to re-traumatize yourself or people, or there's pleasures in life that we experience as well. So to reconcile with our traumas and pleasures, I feel this was a really great answer because it allows me to connect to how important it is to heal before you share something so personal.
I think, and with this too, right? Like this is poetry in prose, and there are, there are jokes in here too. And I say jokes like it's not, set up a punchline, here you go. But there are, elements of lightness, right? Because that is part of a healing journey as well, right? And it's a good reminder of like, okay, these things could happen, but, the world still keeps going, right? It's still going to spin. And so I say that of thinking, in stand-up comedy, like if you've ever been, like listening to a comic and they say something, that is crazy, outlandish, or, like really personal in nature, and like everyone's cry laughing because they're telling a story and they've healed from it, right? And we might not know that, right? But it's just the way that the joke lands that everyone laughs. Then you can have someone that comes out there and it doesn't, and you can tell they're not healed. They're just saying
wow.
And you can feel it. Like we might not understand what's happening, but that is what's happening.
Or they're healing in the process right in front of you.
Or they're trying.
They're trying. Oh my God, I can't wait to hear a piece. I would love for you to read something for us on the mic today. And we'll come back to that in the third act. But where can people get this book?
People can get this book at, well, I'll start with Amazon because it's there and you can get it in 2 days. Amazon, also please leave a review.
And we'll put a link on this episode on the text body so you can get it.
And then very proudly, if you're in the local LA area, or if you're not, I know Roman's Bookstore has it online, Book Soup has it online, and if you're super local to Los Feliz, there was a couple copies left at Skylight Books.
Yes, congratulations. Oh my goodness, what a journey. I am so happy that I have an autographed book.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you so much, one, for getting the book. And just, it's so interesting too, like meeting you. And I knew that I wanted to be, well, I was a writer, right? I was writing all the time, and I left a corporate, completely different realm type of job. And, but that was the part where I was still, processing and writing, and not processing the emotions, but it was still, I was sitting with it. I never had more time in my life just to sit there with me. And I remember us talking, and you was like, oh, you're supposed to share your creativity. And it was just the divine timing of when you said this, right? Like I had been like, what am I doing with this? Like, am I really going to show other people? I hand it to a couple family members that were like, oh, you should do something with this, right? But and you were really out of nowhere, right? Just walking your dogs, getting coffee one day, and you were like, and then you just went into this beautiful poem about sharing creativity. And I remember I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing.
Well, that's what I love about spending time with you, is that I always connect and I'm always learning, and I feel that we're always unraveling these layers. I feel like I get to know you more and more each time. And I was thinking about certain things about how we performed together at a tattoo parlor. Never done that before.
Likewise.
But also performing at the Poetry Lounge, and I know you performed stand-up before as well. Yeah. And I'd really love to get into your biography and share your biography with people, because I feel like there's more to meets the eye, and I'm really curious to share your story. And if we could just take us back to the beginning. Where'd you come from? Where are you from?
It's funny because that that question is complicated. And it is. And it's funny because I'm always like, oh, simplify it. And I think I've been trying to do that my whole life. And then finally I'm like, you know what? It's not simple. And I say that it's because like usually people are like, well, where did you grow up? And I'm like, well, 15 different places,
Wow.
right? And I don't even know if it's that many or if there's more, right? Or there was just always so much change and so it's always, and it's funny that you even asked that because I wrote that last night in my journal, what's your story, right? And I'm like, well, and like everyone, it's part of like the human process, right? There's so many stories.
And you're a writer, you're a New Yorker, you're a veteran.
Yes.
Oh my God. Like there's
yes.
not a veterinarian, but a veteran.
Yes. Am a veteran. I joke that Uncle Sam was my sugar daddy. That was like, one of my main stand-up jokes when I did stand-up comedy like 2 times. But I joined the Army, was active duty. Then I always say that I wised up and then joined the Air Force afterwards, which I did. I actually was stationed on some Air Force bases, and I was like, oh, they live really nice, so let me do this instead. And so altogether, I was in the military for 7 years.
Wait, so you were in the Army and the Air Force?
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
Yes.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you. It really was a means to go to school for me, right? So I was like, well, I looked around me and, just family members. No one knew how to set goals or reach them. And there was just a lot of addiction and different things kind of running rampant through my family base. And it wasn't like, oh, just then and there. It had been happening generationally, right? And so it's so interesting when I think of, or people were like, oh, I'm the black sheep of my family, where I was always kind of the white sheep, right? Like I was like kind of this like off one because I was like the one that was like, how can I go to college? How can I do these things, right? And my friend like, what is she talking about, right? So
goodness.
it was yeah.
Well, that's, wow. 7 years in the military. And were you a writer before them? Like, how old were you? Like, or let me ask you a different way. When did you discover that you were going to be a writer?
This is interesting. I think I was like 11 years old when I was like, I'm going to write a book. And so I would start, like, I think I would get like 1 page in and like, I would love to see those. Like, it was like my uncle did, like, it was just like random stuff that I knew it was like, this is weird stuff. And at the time it was like, I remember my like uncle gave my brother like this like pig, like this like baby pig, and that would be
real life
like
pig?
a real live pig because he lived in like Texas on a farm.
Wow.
And like we lived in Nevada, like in an apartment, like there was no place for a pig, so it was like really random. And I remember like doing this road trip with my grandmother and my little tiny brother at the time, and he had this like new pig, like, and we're like, what are we gonna do that? And then we got home and like my mom, everyone was like, what the hell do we do? Because like there wasn't cell phones back then. It was like,
Right.
Why do you have this pig? And so, that's like kind of a funny story, but it was also just kind of the logic that people weren't really thinking logically. Yeah, I don't even know why I just told that story. Oh, because of the book, right? I remember then, and so always kind of playing around with like writing different things here and there. And then it never went away. I would just have these different random times in my life that I'd be like, I'm writing a book. And then I would start, and then, I have a lot of scrap pages. I'll say that.
And when you were in the military, were you still writing? I mean, did you have time to write?
Like, not really. I think when I was in the military, that was like, the first time when you're like away from, that was the first time for me that I was like actually away from like my mother and like different, and I shouldn't say not my first time away from my mother. Like my mother, when I was born, like she just couldn't take care of me, right? She had a lot of, she just was really prone to self-medicating. She just couldn't take care of me. And so I moved around with a lot of different family members. So I didn't actually move with my mom, my brother, and then who became my stepdad and eventually like my actual father until I was like 10 years old. And, so that's quite some time. And I think when I got there, right, and I was like, okay, I want a family so bad, let me just act like everything's normal. And so then I talk about being the white sheep. I like went into like school, got good grades, getting into high school. In high school, you wouldn't have known. I was like a cheerleader. I was all of these things, like all American, because I didn't want anyone to know that like that things were broken, or heaven forbid that I was broken even a little bit. And I think that that's a common thing that we all do when we're young, or like, trying to, hide different things, right? Or we all don't want, and now we know, oh, that's how the light comes in, right? But when we're young, we don't know that. And so it was like this interesting way of me just trying to pretend that it wasn't happening. And so when I went to the military, it was like the first time kind of being away from that. And then, yeah, I don't know, interesting time.
Oh, wow.
I should have been writing, but I wasn't.
I went to military school, and I had a lot of opportunities to join the military, but I actually did not. But I've always been close to it. It's always been a special place in my heart. I have a lot of friends from the military and worked on commercials for the military. So it's always been a very interesting part of life for me. And so thank you for what you've done in the military for us, and thank you for serving our country.
Thank you.
What was your MOS in there?
I love when someone says, what was your MOS? Because it's not a question that I hear very often now. And that's another thing. So, I mean, I've been out for like 15 years, 10, 15 years. I don't know. I lose count. So things like MOS, people don't usually say anymore, especially like in New York and LA, right? Because I've just like lived so many different lives in this one life. But I was a 88 November, which is a transportation coordinator, logistics in the Army. So just would move people, things, and get kind of like wartime ready. And then when I joined the Air Force, I told you when I was like, I wised up, I'm joining the Air Force. And then I was like, I want the cushiest job. And so I was human resources.
Oh, God. Wow.
Yeah.
And so you must be really good at traveling.
Yes. I love it.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah.
And so you get out of the military, right?
Yes.
And now you're in the private sector.
Yes.
Right. And so after the military, where does your life go in terms of artistic endeavors?
It's interesting, too, to say artistic endeavors, where, right, in a way, everything is artistic, right? Like, we're human beings, like, we're all artists, and we're all creating our life. But if you would ask me then, like, was it artistic, right? Where I think there was, like, a little bit of, like, survival mode. Obviously, I have, like, this family stuff that I, kind of always felt unstable. I joined the military, kind of found that stability. And then, like, now I think I never saw myself in the military long term, right? Where I saw myself is, like, writing and living in New York City. Not even in LA, but like here we are.
And you mentioned school. Like, did you actually like use like GI Bill to go to school?
Oh, yeah. So I got my undergrad it was advertising and marketing. And then I went back to school and then got an MBA, right? So, which is cool, right? To have an MBA, a master's degree, and then this is what I said at the bookstore. And when it came out, I was like, wow, I just said that out loud. It's true to me. But like, I also saw a couple of my friends were like, we didn't know this, right? And I know, I'm like, oh, a lot of people wouldn't know this. But I was the first person in my family tree to graduate high school.
Wow.
Let alone go off and earn a master's degree. Right. And then moved to New York City, get a job in biotech marketing. Right. It was just a totally different life. And yeah, white sheep.
White sheep. So you get to New York, and what's life in New York like? You become this New Yorker.
I loved becoming a New Yorker. That was one of, if I think of like a dream that I had somehow made true, right? It was living in New York. So there was nothing more exciting to me than to get to New York City. Like, I actually feel honored to like not like the things that are shitty about New York. I was like, oh, like I get to smell that heap of garbage. Like, what an honor to like like, I thought it was the coolest thing
The
ever.
steam in the subway.
Yeah, right. And I'm like, oh, that guy is yelling again. Like, how cool, right?
Those bagels as you're walking by.
Yeah. Oh, I could live off 99-cent pizza. What was cool, I didn't have to, right? When I moved to New York, like, I was set up really nice with this, like, great job. Like, I mean, it was really such a cool thing, like, coming, like, if I think of, like, the biggest, like, transition, right? It was, like, thinking of when I was, like, a little girl to, like, moving into, you know, the middle of Manhattan and, like, knowing, like, it was just wonderful. It was coolest thing.
I lived in New York for 10 years, so big New York chapters for me are such a compelling conversation that anybody who's lived in New York, it opens up this different part of my brain. Like, oh, I have something I can talk to you about.
We've all, like, done that speed walking skills, like, to, like, pass, like, a tourist. And it was interesting, though. I remember thinking that because I was like, oh, finally I live in a place where, like, my impatience is paying off, right? Or, like, and now it's another interesting transition of, like, after leaving New York, right? So this is the biggest transition. I actually had never, until that moment, I've never left a chapter that I loved. Ooh. Which is, like, a big, beautiful deal, right? To like all of the chapters in life, I was like, oh, let's close that. Like, let's close that and pretend that one didn't exist, right?
My friend Carrie Ann James once told me you should always leave a place while you still want to be there so that you can always go back.
Oh, I love that.
So that's what that reminds me of.
Yeah. And that is what, like, I absolutely love New York. I think that you get to this, like, little place where, for me, especially, like, in Midtown, which I was there the whole time, and I was, like, rushing to Grand Central all the time, and getting on the train and doing that, and I remember, like, waking up sometimes to be like, I don't want to transport myself to the office, which I don't even know what that meant, but I just was like, I was exhausted, right? There was an energy there, but I also missed, and I didn't even know that I loved nature so much until I lived there. Like, I missed the sunsets. Like, it's something when you're in the middle of Midtown, like, that you don't see.
It's gone by like 4:00.
Yeah. And then also when it happened, like, you can't really tell. Like, you're just in the middle of buildings. And
how long were you in New York?
I was only in New York for like 5 years.
Oh my God, that's amazing.
Yes. But, so 10 years, that is a long time. Like, I think they say after 8 years, you actually become, like, an official New Yorker.
Exactly.
So, like, you did get your passports.
I sure did. But the winters, oh my God, the winters I would escape, like, halfway through. I was like, ugh.
Winters are bad, but I always think too. So when I left New York, I was, like, actually interviewing for different biotech jobs, completely different from creativity, right? Which I knew, like, there was the feeling in my heart whispering, like, you have other work to do.
Right.
Like, this is not it, right? But a whole other conversation. But I remember, like, interviewing with a couple places. One was in San Francisco and one was in Boston. And I just, like, couldn't do Boston. Like, I was like, I cannot do a winter. Like, I can only put up with winter for New York City, but, like, nowhere else. Like, and this is why I live in Los Angeles. Like, I don't want to be cold ever again.
So you're this young woman living in New York. You're working in biotech marketing. You're a veteran, right? You are exploring that part of your life. And you mentioned that there's still some sort of, like, writer vibes, right? Like, at what point in New York did you feel the vibration of writing, like, coming back?
When I moved to New York, I was on the tail end. I had, like, just went through a shit ton of therapy because I was getting a divorce, right? And so through that process, like, it was my first time going to, at that time, it was, like, marriage counseling. And, like, literally, like, session 1 dinged all these light bulbs, right? Where it was so much, and we were not a match. And, that's a whole other can of, some of the stuff is in here. And so it wasn't like, oh, I'm divorced and now I have, like, this is so hard. It was like, oh, wow. The reason I even was in this marriage to a person that I should have never married is because of this family stuff. It's because of these insecurities. It's because of the stuff that I didn't want to, like, own, really, right? And it was like, so I'm always like, people talk about manifestation and working hard and doing that. I'm like, yes, yes, yes. Like, I'm a believer in that. Like, you don't come and do these like cool things if you don't believe in yourself and see yourself in different things and keep working hard. But there's also that part of you, this like emotional healing that needs to kind of catch up, or at least
Yes.
in my experience. And I get to New York. I had this therapist. Like, she like truly saved my life. Like, I think of like a therapist. Like, I've had 2 true therapists in my life, and they are like angels in my like life story. And just, it was pouring out of me, like writing nonstop. And I knew then that it's like important, like, and even still now, like, I'm like, you have to share your story, right? You have to, and it's not like, oh, I want everyone to know my story. It's fun. It's not, right? But it's like, oh, this helps other people. This is like, you haven't been doing this, all of this for nothing, and not nothing, but it was just the whisper, right? And it's always the intuitive whisper that's quiet, that's easy for us to be like, not right now, right? I got stuff to do, not right now. And then your ego will start taking over and like, gotta go to work, gotta do this. What are you talking about? Writing doesn't make money, you know, like all of this stuff. And it was always there whispering. And I think that that's, when I think actually about like when I finally did leave my job, I think it's the burnout was almost compounded because of that whispering of my intuition being like, you need to focus on this. Like, this is what you came here to do.
Not only are you getting a divorce from a human, but you're also getting a divorce from your life, your job, a city.
Yeah, I mean, there was a little bit of time within that, right? So like when I got to New York City, divorce, like that was a wrap, right? And so I had plenty of time, you know, and I also, like, I was doing the work then, right? Like, I was writing, I was in therapy, like, it was really getting into, like, it was my very first sound bath, like, you know, really, like, meditation. I was like, oh, there's this whole other part where I think that was kind of the catalyst for being like, oh, what is, and my therapist said this, and it was the question that, like, really is the most impactful, and actually that question is in here, and it was like, what is the relationship with yourself? Oof. And I remember, like, being kind of stunned, like I didn't even know how to answer it. I didn't know what a sample, like, not that I was trying to bullshit my therapist, right? But if I wanted to, I couldn't, because I was like, what does that even, what words are coming out of her mouth? Right? That's how much I didn't realize, like, oh, like, there's a relationship that I need to cultivate with me, right? And I think especially for like women and thinking of like your self-worth, your self-esteem, like all of those like little hits, it's like, this isn't the right one. Like, that's not right. You shouldn't be with him. And that's just with him, but like all of those, like, not the right job, those whispers, right? Like, our intuition is quiet and the rest of our stuff is like so loud. And so we'll just be like, oh, da, 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 and like justify. But every single time we do that, we're like diminishing our self-esteem, right? So when, you know, we're like, oh, I don't trust myself, it's because we're not listening to ourselves, right? And so when she was like, what is the relationship with yourself? Like, it was literally like, how can I do the best homework I can do? Like, how can I cultivate the best relationship that anyone has ever had with themselves, right? Like, how can I be, right? Where there's a little bit of me that I have to stop and like every time when I'm like, there's something about like self-development, personal growth, right? Like a type A overachiever that I also now learned, oh, you don't get to be like, let me do all the inner work I can and do it really quickly and do a good job. Like, that's also not how it works. Right. But it took me a while to learn that as well. But yes, learnings and learnings. So in New York, that's what I was doing. I was cultivating that relationship with myself.
My sister and I just got into like father wounds and mother wounds.
Yes.
And how healing the mother wound helps you nurture yourself, and healing the father wound helps you discipline yourself. And the balance of both nurture and discipline is very instrumental to like forward progress.
Ooh, I love that. I knew about the nurturing, but the father wound, the discipline, that's hitting something here.
Yeah.
Thank
thank her. She when she said it to me, she stunned me, and it put me in like a place of thought for like 24 hours.
Yeah.
And now where I'm like, when I'm moving through the day and I don't want to do something because I feel lazy or discouraged, I prompt myself like mother wound, father wound, nurture, discipline, and it just happens like little by little.
Wow.
And you know, turning the degree of the boat like 1 degree a day to be like 360 days, 60 degrees better. And so thank you for sharing all that. That, like, I feel that if I would have met you in New York, we probably would have had a different experience as, you know, as who we are to each other.
100%. I think that just because I was also pretty, like, even though I was starting to do the work, right, and it meant a lot to me, and it's saying the inner work,
Yes.
right? I still was like very much in survival mode, and I say that to be like, you talk about creativity, and I read this quote the other day that was like, it's hard, you can't be in creativity and survival mode at the same time.
Oh,
and like that really hit me.
I agree.
Right. So even when you're like, oh, were you writing or were you doing this and that? And it was always within me, right? I told you I was like 11, I'm writing a book. Somehow I like knew this, but I had been in survival mode for so long. And to be honest, I think I was in survival mode until I moved here.
Oh my goodness. What
Yeah.
a cliffhanger. I've heard the same thing about creating a family, right? Like you can't create a family if you are in survival mode.
Wow.
Right? So as any creative like flex.
You
like,
can try, but
try.
then your daughter has to go to a lot of therapy.
Exactly. Oh my God, what a cliffhanger. Yes, creating out of survival mode. Oh my goodness. I've tried it, fail all the time or get a little percentage, but tell me about your journey to LA and creativity and coming out of survival mode.
Yeah. Oh, ooh, I love this. Coming out of survival mode. So I moved from New York, which I said this was like my best chapter. And those romantic partnerships, they are always an invitation, an opportunity for you to learn more. And so I say this, so it had been like, I'd been divorced for 3.5 years. My first relationship, which I felt so excited, well, obviously because it was a relationship, but I was so happy. Like he wanted children. He was very intentional about me. Like it was, you know, a lot of good things. And he was actually from California. And so when it was like Boston or California, even though I met him in New York, it was like, okay, so I took a position in San Francisco. And so it was, and I trust all the timing. I get to San Francisco, he's coming too, right? Like now, okay, like we're in California, we're gonna start like this like journey together. And we get to San Francisco, and within a couple of weeks, the pandemic hits.
Oh God.
Which obviously everyone has a ton of stories about the pandemic and how that was for them. But it's about coming out of survival mode, this question. And so it didn't work out. It was an opportunity to be like, oh, wow, how do people work under pressure? Like this is just not going to work for me. And so we broke up.
And were you guys living together?
We had just moved. Yeah.
Wow. So
Yeah.
that's like a higher concentration of time.
Yes.
It's like 6 months is like a year and a half.
Yes. And he had been like, you know, was like kind of like a traveling like medical salesperson, right? So he was just not even used to being in one spot. And so there's like, I was making excuses sometimes, being like, this is not great behavior. This is not right. And I also would give everyone like, you know, none of us have been in this spot before. Like, how would we know what to do? This is a scary time.
Right.
But it was just like, oh, and I actually give that baseline or like, I'm so proud of that time in therapy or time spent with myself, because I think, because he had so many great qualities about him, that I think that if I wasn't like tuned in to be like, ooh, this is like really hitting my inner peace. Like if I didn't know those or have that skill set yet, I probably still would be like with him and maybe been on my like second unhappy marriage or something. Like, I don't know.
But you're coming out of survival mode. You find a new partner. You move to a new city, and then once again, pandemic happens.
Yeah.
You're back in survival mode.
Yes, right. And then we were working from home. I'm like getting ready to like launch this project, so it's like Zoom calls all the time. Which at first I was like, oh, I want to work from home, and then we were just like on calls nonstop. Like it became more exhausting. The drug didn't launch. There were so many things happening with the work stuff too, right? And so it was interesting because that drug didn't launch, right? And the team was wonderful. I had to go to this other team it was an opposite. The other team was so warm and wonderful and open, and this was like the direct opposite of that. And I'm saying all this, like, we broke up. I did not like San Francisco. I was there for 11 months. And that I finally put my stuff in storage because we were working from home. I went to spend time with my, the man that I call my father, but he did raise me since I was, like a teenager. But I went back to visit my family in Utah, and then every time I would look at places in San Francisco, I started to really learn how to trust my intuition. And like that, I would listen to that like whisper more, right? Like I put everything, and now I'm like so proud. If anything, like I put more emphasis on the little whisper than any noise around me.
Come to Los Angeles.
Yeah, and it was like, and my like ego, my head was like, why would you go to Los Angeles? Like all of the stereotypes that I thought about Los Angeles, like, oh, like you had
never lived here before?
No, I had never thought of living here before.
You had visited before?
I had visited like Santa Monica and like a couple, like I never came to Los Feliz. I like didn't even know what Los Feliz existed, right? But it was like,
oh, we're gonna get to that right now.
Yeah. I was like, I don't know. I joked with my friend, like I became LA curious, and then a girlfriend and I, so she lived in Brooklyn. And then she came, she's originally from Napa. She was here like over the pandemic too. And so we came to Los Angeles and like stayed at like Airbnbs at a couple different like neighborhoods. Still, Los Feliz is not on my radar. I like never knew about this. And then, yeah, there was something that just felt so comforting about like consistent warm weather, especially like San Francisco and New York. Right. And I was like, I left New York, like my favorite city in the entire world, for this this dream of like a warm, lovely place, like, and that wasn't San Francisco.
Right.
And so
palm trees and sunshine.
Yes. So I just listened to that little voice. I came here. I liked it. And it's also like everybody was like to themselves, right? So it wasn't like, oh, you need a friend base yet.
And this is during the pandemic that you're coming here.
Yeah, it's very pandemic-y. I mean, we're like getting toward, but we're still like wearing masks and things. And then it's funny, I was like, well, let's just see. And so I came here for a week, and like I was still working, but it was like a long, like from a weekend to a weekend. And I was like, and in between, I'll go look at places and just see if this works. The same time, like when I had like tried to find places in San Francisco, even though that little whisper, I'm like, oh, well, this place will work. And I would email them, and like people wouldn't get back to me. It was just like very like, this is not to be. I came to Los Angeles that 1 week. I looked at different places. Most of them were like by the beach. If it's not a like instant yes, then it's a no.
Right, that's that Scorpio vibe.
Yes. And yeah, I don't even know how there's like this place that came up in Los Feliz. I like looked at people who live here love it here. Like I didn't know about this neighborhood. I drove up. I saw this like red gate. I was like, oh my God, that's so charming. I love it. But we'll see, right? And as soon as the man opened the door, I was like, yes. Like, I knew that was my apartment. Like, I didn't even, and even when people started to, like, they saw theirs and they came funneling through, like, I was like, get out of my home. Like, I knew.
Instantly.
Yes.
That happened to me, too, in Los Feliz.
Yes, and it's funny because I had already, like, been like, you know what? Like, just envision driving back to Utah. Because remember, I told you I put my stuff in storage in San Francisco.
And
just envision.
San Francisco was wrapped. New York was wrapped.
Yeah, and San Francisco, it made the most sense to go back there. Like, my job was there.
Right.
Oh, that's another thing. Yeah, like, my job was there. But I was just like, okay, just be okay. Like, accept that you might be going back to Salt Lake and you don't really have anything to show for this trip, right? And I was like, all right. And then as soon as I walked in, I was like, yes. I knew I did the application. Even when I was driving back to Utah, I was like, it's my apartment. Like, I just knew it. And then, like, it was like 4 days later, they're like, okay, you got the place. And then I was like, all right.
Congratulations.
I'm moving to Los Angeles.
And now you're a Los Felician. You're in the neighborhood. And
coming out of survival mode. So walking around this neighborhood, like, it just felt, and it still feels like magic, right? Like, I've never seen so many hummingbirds in my entire life.
Oh, right.
Like, at one point, this, like, a hummingbird came, like, buzzed literally like hovercraft right by my face. I swear we made eye contact. And then he like buzzed off and I was like, okay, here I am. This is the first place that I've lived. And I was like, I don't know when or why I would ever leave. Right. And that was like really cool to find a place. And then that survival mode, I'm starting to thaw. And then my job in San Francisco wanted me to move back. Basically, I started going back to the office. It wouldn't make sense. I would have had to keep flying back on like my own merit. And so it was like, it would have made sense to move back, but I didn't want to. And so it was the very only time that I have ever quit a job without a job. Like,
wow. What a bold move.
Bold move. And it's been a year and a half. They talk about that whisper, like listening to it. And it was like, I can't keep doing this. Like, it is not, I don't know what is it, but I know this isn't, and I'm not going to figure it out with this. Right? Like, I remember, like, even being on, like, it's funny to even think about, like, therapy and, like, having, like, breakthrough sessions on, like, Zoom and, like, wiping my tears and be like, okay, I gotta go to a meeting, right? And, like, how you're just, like, pushing that down. And, like, this last year and a half, like, right, this came out of it so much. And it sounds ridiculous to say this, but, like, I just, like, laid there one day for, like, 4 hours. And this was in the beginning, right? Of like leaving and just being like, whoa, what is this time? Like, what is this? Like, I've had a job since I was 15. I was in the military. I was, right, like, I am used to like someone saying jump and me saying how high, right? So what is this that I get to create? And it was overwhelming and it was wonderful. And I remember laying on my floor, right? Like, not even with a yoga mat, just like laying there. I have plenty of like furniture, but I was laying there and I just heard this, like, how does it feel to be safe in your body?
Yeah, wow.
And I just cried and just stared at the wall. And it was coming out of survival mode. So that's a book on itself.
And out of all places in LA, Los Feliz, the happies.
I know. It's so great.
So you're living in Los Feliz, and I credit our fur babies for us becoming friends.
Yes.
Because I don't think that I think both of us having dogs is the reason we met.
Oh, for sure.
Because I feel like connecting with Lola and Ted really connected us.
Honestly, if I didn't have Ted, I don't know if I would have friends. Like, he's the main.
He's a matchmaker.
He really is. Like, he has a little, finesse about him.
Oh, yeah. But he's so cute.
Yes, I know. He's ridiculous. He knows it.
Has he been part of this whole journey of New York, San Francisco, all this? Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So it's cool that New York, like, Ted used to be a New Yorker, and now I'm just like, I know how skittish he is. I'm like, I'm so sorry I did that to you, buddy. Like, right? Of like so many loud sounds, and there wasn't anything for him to smell. I mean, obviously we made it work and we loved our lives, but I think I loved my life there. I think Ted didn't. I think he just was, true partner was like, I'll do this for you.
Got it.
But he loves Los Feliz. He loves our building. He loves our neighbors. He loves every single plant around here. Like, yeah.
Oh my God. I'm so glad that we both have doggies, that we both met and we have become friends and have shared some artistic endeavors together. I've seen you perform. You've seen me perform.
Yes.
And you've written this book. And now that we're getting back to the present, right? We're in Los Feliz.
Yes.
You have come out of survival mode. And at what point in Los Feliz journey did you crystallize the thought to write this book?
I had been writing. I'm still writing this other one. It really is about, having this, like, starting with this, like, panic attack in LAX. But it was like that, we cannot keep doing this. It was like that moment of, like, we can't be in survival mode any longer, right? And so that's, like, the story of everything. But I told you I had been, like, writing these things. Like, when I say, like, even in the intro of here,
she's got the book open. She's got the book. Are we going to get a little passage reading here?
I mean, I think the intro tells you a lot with this question because, like, it had been years of personal growth, right? Even decades. So, right, there's, like, a couple on here, or, like, 2 waves. One is about, like, it's called Relationships, the Bad Ones. And then the next is called Versus the Really Bad Ones, right? the really bad ones, like that was like kind of those moments and realizations, and those like I had like been writing, like that was like divorce time, right? So like I had these pieces all around, like I was like, to be like, I was sitting on gold, but like I had these things all around. And so I think it was here when someone's like, you almost like that thing of like, you're making this harder for yourself. Like you already are, which is true, right? Like you already are what you want to be.
Right.
You already are a writer. You already have these things. And so it was cool when I was around here and I was like, okay, you're right. Like I'm going to put these together. And that's when I started doing like, oh, what kind of light waves are there, right? And it was like, no. And here's the creative process, which I've learned here, right? Is that like, when I try to type A it or any, like being like, okay, I'm going to make myself do X, Y, and Z. Anytime that I don't want to say militant or corporate, it doesn't, like, my whole site was like, we will not do this. As soon as I say, hey, let's have fun with this, how much fun can I have with this? It just falls into place. And
wow, that's so that's incredible that you said that. Like using the tactics of your previous lives of corporate, military, doesn't really click.
Yeah.
It's a little forceful. But yet when you surrender to the actual process of creating,
yes,
it flows.
Right? Isn't it interesting though? We're saying this, and that's goes back to that creativity in survival mode.
Right.
Right. Of like, I have to do this, and creativity, or at least my creative is like, no.
Right.
Like how much joy, how much fun, even though this is heavy stuff, right? But like, but you've already processed that. Like how much can you have fun with this now, right? And so it was interesting once I was like, okay, instead of me trying to decide how this needs to be organized, right? Let me see if there's a natural flow to these, right? Because I already had like 85 different prose or like different things, right? I started being like, okay, out of curiosity, let's just see, right? And playing around, and I started putting them in their waves.
Wow.
Like automatically. And I was like, oh, this already tells a story, and it literally tells a story throughout. And then it was cool because I'm like all of like the different like prose and names. The funnest part of me was like naming things, right? And so that was like so fun. And then I was like, okay, well now I have to like name the waves, like 10 chapters. And I was like, again, let's have fun with this. And it's funny to think of like how I have fun with it. It generally is like me getting a bunch of like Swedish fish and like really random squirt. Like, do you know that soda? It's like a grapefruit soda. Yes. It's so good.
Actually, I do know squirt very well.
Okay, yeah. So grapefruit soda, big fan. Especially the mini cans. So if you get the mini cans,
they're
right?
like
then
shots.
they're like shots. And you're like, oh look, they're even more fun, right? And so then while I'm like, okay, I'm having fun with the Swedish fish and little squirt, then I sat down to be like, okay, let's just see what comes out. And then I wrote all 10 titles in one bloop, 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 bloop. Like it just came flowing out. And I loved them. I think I made like a couple tweaks, right? And even my editor was like, oh, good. Like they were done.
When I think about creativity, I think about me as a child learning to paint, learning to connect neurons with music and language and art and music, science, and just playing. To me, creativity is playing, but it serves like this like great understanding of brain developing, right? So what I find interesting is by the time you get to Los Feliz, you're out of survival mode, you start placing these waves, and from what I'm taking away is everything in the book already exists. It's just a matter of like putting it together.
The base of it existed. Right, where there was still plenty of it, which was really cool too, because there was still more to purge, right? And I'm like, oh, well, let me just, so then when I'm like, okay, I'm going to put this, I'm going to put it together in a book. And I was like, okay, well, you still need more, right? And then I was like, well, some of the stuff I'd wrote before, and then it was just like, they also say this too, right? Like as soon as you decide, the universe will help you out, right? Exactly. Or as soon as you're the one making the decision, like you're already creating your life, like you're the creator. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to make this into a book. Then they just started coming out, right? And then there was like some obviously emotions like resurfacing, right? But it was so interesting to see how it almost combined all versions of me, right? Like we talk about like, oh, like I've lived so many lives and here and here and here. And then I was like, oh, like one is called Aloof AF, right? And it was like, oh, it stemmed from a story that happened, which I will not get into, but that happened here in Los Feliz, but it like triggered something that was like happening in the past.
Wow.
And then so that just came out and I was like, okay, awesome. There's still more here to do. And so, but once I decided, it happened quickly, which is, I'm like almost like taking pause in that because it's also a reminder too to my other endeavors. Cause I'm like, okay, to start. And I still have to be like, no,
Right.
it will not come until I'm like having fun with it and not trying to like hold on to it too tightly.
Exactly. Is there a piece in the book you could share with us?
Layers and Waves, Introduction. Somewhere between the layers of illusion and the waves of healing, I find myself here, whole, alive, mostly happy, centered and free. The greatest transformations never happen overnight. They often take months, years, even decades to unfold, usually requiring us to dig, release, mourn, accept, laugh, and simply be. This writing collection spans over years of personal growth, heavy tears, and pops of inspiration. My journal has often acted as a meditation cushion, providing a safe place to process the layers of emotions and illusions begging to be seen. Pain, like our inner child, must be acknowledged to truly begin to heal. Healing isn't easy. The waves are unpredictable and you don't get any control over them. But you can learn to ride these waves, to flow with their current, to make space for them to surface. Your own power and wisdom comes not from trying to control nature, but by joining forces with it. I hope the softest part of you reads this, just as I hope you welcome your own inner healing by recognizing each layer and every wave is for you. It's always been for you.
The softest part of you. Oh my God. You know, I feel very honored to have your book, but also this is a very rare moment for me to have a book and the author in my home, kicking it here, being creative. And I'm so grateful for you to be here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Anything else that I've missed? Like what? Now that you have this book in your hand, you're reading it, it's out in the world,
Yeah.
and you're working on something else.
Yeah.
Like, and you're in Los Feliz. Like, how's life now? Like,
You know, I think it's kind of like this book, right? Like healing comes in waves, right? And it's all a healing journey. It's all a creative journey, right? Where there's like moments I feel very strongly of like, okay, do X, Y, and Z. And then other days I'm like, what am I doing again? Right? But then you're like, oh, but now I know that is what this is, that is what life is, right? And to like trust that and trust the process and things that are for you, they will come together. You know, and it's almost like there's so much obviously in this book, right? So many things to share, but I do feel strongly about the very end, which is conclusion.
Let's hear it.
Conclusion. There is none. We just keep going.
Wow. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and that's what we're doing. So,
That is amazing.
yeah. Thank you.
Oh my God, congratulations. Anything else that I've missed or anything else that you'd like people to know about you or creativity from your point of view?
I do want to read this one.
Yes.
I think it's just because it's something that we've been talking about, especially being in that creative space or like coming out of survival mode, right? And so, you know, even some backstory. So this wave is called, they call it surrender. It feels like flow. Mm-hmm. It's called white space.
All right.
There's so much space to fill or not to fill. White space, best used with concernment and constraint. Time has expanded itself in front of me, so wild, beautiful, and free. Is it the ego that sees all the space and freaks? I must fill this time and space immediately, reaching for the first distraction it can see. Is it my soul that sees all the space and quietly whispers, finally?
Oh my goodness.
Right? That was the moment that I knew that, like, there's so much, like, oh, you should get a job. What are you doing? Da, 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 all of this other stuff. And then that little whisper was like, you need this. Like, we don't know what's happening. Like, or right? Part of you doesn't know what is happening, but that little intuitive spot was like, no. Like, you just be.
I find you very inspiring. Every time I see you, I just feel energized and ready to create.
Thank you.
And also ready to listen and absorb. So I feel like I'm always learning with you.
Thank you.
And I'm
so
very
much.
honored to have you on the mic today.
I am
sharing
honored
your
too.
story and your work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here. High five.
Yeah. Woohoo.
All right.
Do we get to say cut?
Cut.